The train to St. Louis had rattled like an old kettle, but the stagecoach west of there sounded like bones in a barrel. Annabeth Coulter sat stiff back between a sweating ranch hand and a pious old woman who clutched a Bible like it might leap away. Her gloved hands were folded, eyes fixed on the horizon. She hadn't spoken since morning. There was nothing left to say. She'd sold her mother's brooch for the fair, sewn her name into the hem of her last good dress, and left Boston behind without looking back. The letter in her bag was carefully folded, worn from rereading. Asterisk Thomas Cade, age 38, veteran, owns land, water access, no kin. Asterisk his writing had been brief but respectful. He needed a wife. She needed a life. Somewhere away from factories and whispers and men who lied with polite voices. The land stretched endlessly now, as if God had poured sand over the earth and forgot the rest. Mesas burned gold in the sun. A line of vultures circled high above like blackened petals on the wind. Dust caked the windows and their lips. No one talked. The driver's whip cracked in rhythm with the creaking wheels, keeping time like a dying heartbeat. At noon, the coach paused near a dying cottonwood. The ranch hand muttered something about Red Butte Pass, and the driver spat into the dirt. Annabeth stepped down to stretch her legs. The air was dry, brittle. She looked around and saw no shade, no water, no reason for anything to live out here. "Best hurry, miss," the driver warned. "This stretch ain't safe." She climbed back in. The door slammed. The coach lurched forward again. As they rolled into the pass, the canyon walls grew taller, redder. Shadows pooled between the stones. The air grew quiet, too quiet, like the land was holding its breath. The old woman clutched her Bible tighter. The ranch hand's fingers twitched near the knife at his belt. Then came the first shot. The driver cried out and pitched forward, reins flying. Horses screamed and stumbled. The coach tilted. Another gunshot cracked the silence wide open. Screams erupted. A bullet shattered the window beside Annabeth's face, spraying her with slivers of glass and sunlight. "Out! Run!" The door flew open. The ranch hand jumped, then fell screaming with a shot in the back. The old woman clambered out and vanished behind a boulder. Annabeth froze, pressed against the far side, her heart hammering like a freight train. The horses bolted. The coach slammed sideways and collapsed into dust and splinters. Rough hands grabbed her. She kicked, clawed, screamed, but there were too many. Someone tore the bag from her shoulder. Another ripped the bonnet from her head. A man with a scar across his jaw laughed as he caught her by the wrist and dragged her to her feet. "Well, well," he said, eyeing her with a mix of hunger and mockery. "Look what we got here. A fine little dove, all dressed up for a wedding." Annabeth spit in his face. The blow came hard and sudden. Her head snapped sideways. The world spun. "Hold up," another voice drawled, slower, colder. "Let's see what else came with the coach." The speaker stepped into view. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in dusty leather. A black bandana hung loose around his neck. His eyes were pale and dead flat, like water that never moved. This was Clay Murdoch. His name was spoken in low voices in every saloon and sheriff's office west of the Pecos. A wiry teen dragged the half-smashed mailbag to him. Murdoch rifled through it with disinterest until he pulled out a sealed envelope. He broke the seal lazily, read a few lines, then laughed. "Guess she's a mail-order bride. To some fellow named Cade out in Three Pines." He looked her up and down. "Well, you won't be seeing him." "I'm not your property," Annabeth hissed. Murdoch crouched so they were face to face. "Out here, darling, everything's claimed by force or taken by fear. You want to bet which one you're facing." He stood and turned to his men. "Pack the horses. We're headed for the high rocks. And bring the bride." They bound her wrists. She fought, kicked again. One of them yanked her hair hard enough to make her scream. Dust kicked up around them as the gang mounted and rode into the canyons with her at the center, gagged and furious. Behind them, the broken stagecoach lay silent. Blood darkened the sand. The desert wind stirred the shredded mail, lifting the torn corner of the letter that had told her she'd have a home and a husband waiting. It fluttered once, then blew away into the sky. High on a ridge, a crow tilted its head and cawed. The sun began to set. Red Butte Pass fell quiet again. Far to the west, beyond the dry ridges and sun-baked stone, a man named Thomas Cade ran a hand down the worn stock of his rifle. The letter he'd kept sealed on his shelf for weeks still sat unopened beside a cold supper. He didn't know it yet, but a stranger's cry had just entered his life, carried by gunfire and dust and the whisper of fate, and the desert wind carried her name. The heat had settled like an old debt on the Cade Ranch, the kind no one ever really paid off. The land was scrub and stone, brittle mesquite trees, a crooked fence that hadn't seen paint since Lincoln died. A swayback barn leaned into the wind like it might surrender any day. Inside the tiny house at the edge of the property, Thomas Cade poured stale coffee into a chipped tin cup and stared through the dust-caked window at nothing in particular. The dog at his feet, an old mutt with one torn ear and a limp, lifted his head and groaned softly. Outside, the only movement came from the wind flapping the laundry that hadn't been collected since morning. Thomas was a man carved by years rather than age, deep-lined face, skin tanned like old leather, gray streaking through hair that hadn't been trimmed in months. His hands bore the map of a life spent gripping steel and soil. He didn't speak much, didn't smile either. Folks in town called him the ghost on the ridge. They said he'd once picked off 15 Confederates from a bell tower without moving his boots. Said he'd seen too much blood and chose to disappear into dust and cattle instead of living among the rest of them. That morning, the silence broke. The telegraph boy from town rode up on a lathered horse, swinging down with a yellow envelope in hand. "Telegram for Thomas Cade," the boy said, nervous even though Thomas never raised his voice. Thomas took it with a slow nod and watched the kid ride off fast, like the ground might open behind him. He didn't open the message. Not yet. He set it on the table beside the rifle that hadn't been fired in years, then walked outside and went back to work like the news might wait until he was ready. It didn't. An hour later, as he split wood by the corral, the unopened letter still pressed between the pages of his Bible tugged at his conscience. It had come weeks ago, soft script and ink faded slightly from travel. He hadn't read it, hadn't needed to. She was supposed to arrive in a week on the northbound stage. A woman from Boston, name of Annabeth Coulter. Pretty name. She'd written 4 times. He'd written back once. Short, to the point. He hadn't expected hope to feel like a burden. But now the telegram sat there, watching him. Finally, he stepped inside, pulled the letter out from the Bible's hollow, and cracked the wax seal. Her words ran like sunlight through shadow. Asterisk Mr. Cade. I do not expect kindness or love. Only honesty and peace. But I want to believe there's a life waiting west of here, and I believe it might be with you. I don't scare easy. I sew, I cook, I know when to keep quiet and when not to. If you don't want me when I arrive, say so. I won't stay where I'm not welcome. But if there's a chair by your fire, I'll sit in it without complaint. Asterisk. He sat down hard, the letter trembling slightly in his calloused fingers. She was real, not just a name on paper. Not just a thing he'd bought passage for like seed or salt. A woman with spine and soul, who believed a man like him could offer something better than nothing. Then he opened the telegram. Asterisk stage ambushed near Red Butte Pass. 1 female passenger taken. Others dead. Believed to be Miss Coulter. Bandits presumed Murdoch's gang. Asterisk. The paper drifted from his fingers. His eyes moved to the rifle mounted above the hearth. A Spencer carbine. Polished but unused, the last piece of his life from before. He hadn't fired it since Appomattox. His hands were steady as he lifted it down. The dog barked once as Thomas saddled the mule. No words, no second thoughts. He filled a canteen, tied a blanket roll, and slipped Annabeth's letter into the inside pocket of his coat. At the edge of the ranch, he turned once, squinting against the sun. The place looked smaller from a distance. Just a speck of a home in a desert that didn't care whether you stayed or went. He kicked the mule into motion and rode toward town. Midday heat thickened the air. At the sheriff's office in Dry Creek, he dismounted and stepped inside without knocking. Sheriff Jenkins looked up from his desk with tired eyes and a flask that wasn't hidden well. "Kate, heard about that telegram. Sorry to hear it." Thomas nodded once. "Murdoch's boys," Jenkins continued, scratching his chin. "Mean bastards. They got the pass locked down. Anyone goes and don't come out." "I'm going," Thomas said. Jenkins let out a breath like he'd expected that. "You sure? This ain't war anymore." Thomas said nothing, just turned to leave. "She might be dead already," the sheriff offered. Thomas paused in the doorway. "Then I'll bring her back." He didn't wait for the lawman's answer. The town watched him go. Some from behind curtains, some from saloon windows. Old folks whispered to one another about the man who once stopped a charge at Antietam with 6 bullets and 1 prayer, about the rifle that never missed, about the ghost who never came down from his land unless something inside him had stirred. The road to Red Butte Pass was dry and narrow, carved between spines of jagged rock. The trail was littered with hoof prints and wheel ruts, but none recent. A single hawk circled overhead, its cry long and lonely. By dusk, Thomas reached the place where the stage had fallen. Buzzards picked at scraps. A shattered wheel lay half buried in sand. The blackened mark of gunpowder still clung to the stones. He climbed down and studied the scene. Boot prints, small ones, dragged away from the wreckage. Deeper marks beside them. Struggle. Resistance. The canyon walls loomed high and blood-red around him. He touched the earth with his palm, like a priest at a grave. Then he rose, shouldered his rifle, and followed the trail into the narrowing gorge, where the wind howled like a whisper that never ended. The sun dipped behind the rocks. Night fell heavy and black, but Thomas Cade rode on, chasing the breath of a woman he'd never met, armed with a rifle, a letter, and the last ember of something that might still be called hope. The canyon rose like the spine of some ancient beast. Ribs of rust-red rock thrust skyward, wind cutting through the narrow passes in low, mournful howls. Sunlight filtered down in broken beams, catching on the dust and sharp shale. Thornbrush clawed at Thomas's coat as he moved through the tight gorge. He stepped lightly, careful not to dislodge pebbles that might give away his passage. The tracks were still fresh. 8 horses, heavy loads, 1 rider slumped or doubled over. A hostage. He crouched beside a print where someone had stumbled. Blood on the stone. Small droplets scattered. A trail of it veered toward the higher ridges. He touched the dried stain with 2 fingers, then brought them to his nose. Human. Recent. Still warm when it hit. Somewhere up ahead, a raven cawed and flapped away. The dog from back home would have barked at the noise. Thomas missed the sound but didn't mourn it. There was no room for softness out here. The air had teeth, and even the silence could cut. He scanned the ridges, eyes narrowing. They'd chosen a good place to vanish, too good. Each step forward peeled back a layer of him he thought he'd buried. He remembered the ravines of Tennessee, rifles echoing over wet stone, the mud sucking at boots, the blue and gray bodies tangled in silence. He remembered the boy with copper hair who cried for his mother before dying with his hand clenched in Thomas's. He remembered leaving it all behind and promising never to aim a rifle at anything with breath again. But now he moved like a shadow through that same hellscape. 3 nights into the trail, the canyon walls opened slightly, revealing smoke curling low above the rocks, faint, thin, trying not to be seen. A lookout post sat on a ledge near a narrow choke in the trail. The sentry, bored, slumped with his rifle across his lap. Thomas waited until the clouds passed over the moon. A soft crack from the Spencer split the night. The man never even twitched. Down below, nestled in a natural hollow ringed with boulders, the outlaw camp sprawled out like ants across a carcass. Crates, canvas tarps, stolen wagons, horses tied loosely, a fire pit smoldering in the center. And Annabeth. She was tied near one of the larger rocks, wrists bound but her chin held high, defiant. Her hair was a tangled mess, her dress torn and dusty, but her eyes never stopped scanning the shadows. She looked for a way out, even now. That night, she found one. A guard leaned too close while mocking her. She said nothing, waited until he turned his back, then launched at him with a jagged stone she'd hidden beneath her boot. The rock caught him hard across the temple. He dropped like a sack of grain. She grabbed his pistol and ran. She didn't make it far. 2 others tackled her before she reached the horses. She screamed, kicked, bit, but Fist slammed her down. Clay Murdoch strolled into the torchlight like a man arriving at a party. He looked down at her, bleeding, dirt in her teeth, and shook his head with a slow grin. "You've got more venom than a Mojave rattler," he said. He crouched, brushing hair from her face. "Might just marry you myself. Break that wild spirit. Could be fun." She spit blood at him. He laughed. "Bring her to the cliff cage. I don't want her trying that again before the traitor arrives." 2 men dragged her away. Clay watched them go, jaw tight. He didn't like being defied. The last woman who tried that lay buried in an arroyo south of Yuma. By morning, one of the guards was missing. Vanished during night watch. No blood, no shout, no shot. Just gone. His rifle was found leaning against a rock. The men muttered to each other in whispers. Eyes stayed wide and fingers twitched near holsters. Clay snapped at them. "One of you bastards is drunk or playing games. You find out who. You drag him to me." The next night, a second man disappeared. This one had been posted up high near the southern ridge. His lantern was found still burning, swinging from a post. His hat lay in the dirt. By the third night, no one volunteered for watch. Annabeth noticed a change. The nervous way they looked over their shoulders. The extra guns they carried during the day. The low mutters about a ghost in the rocks. She saw it too. Just once, movement in the dark, silent and steady. A shadow passing through the torchlight like a ripple across water. Then a scream. A shot. Silence again. Something was hunting them. And with every vanished man, her hope kindled, just a little more. Murdoch's grip tightened. He beat a man for sleeping. Shot another in the foot for backtalk. He paced now, like a caged wolf, his eyes flicking toward the ridges and peaks. He sent a scout to ride east. The man never returned. Annabeth sat in her cage, little more than a pit covered in a grate, and waited. Not for rescue. She didn't believe in fairy tales. But whatever stalked the gang, it wasn't one of them. It moved too clean, struck too true. She began to believe it might be him. Thomas Cade, the name she'd written on the envelope in spring. The man who had said little and promised less. She'd imagined a cold, sunburnt rancher with calloused hands and a heart closed like a coffin lid. But someone was bleeding for her now. Someone was bringing hell down on men who deserved it. And it gave her strength. The 5th night came. A storm brewed in the distance, lightning forking across the desert floor beyond the canyons. Wind swept through the rocks like angry breath, stirring ash and memory. Thomas lay prone on a high ridge, watching the camp through his scope. 10 left, then 9. He'd mapped the terrain, studied their routine, each movement, each weakness. He hadn't slept more than an hour in days, hadn't eaten more than jerky and hard biscuit, but his hand never trembled. Not once. This wasn't vengeance. Not quite. This was something colder, more exacting. A man keeping a promise he never got to make. He adjusted the scope again. One last night, before he made his presence known, before the storm broke loose. He whispered her name once to the wind, and then vanished into the black. The sky cracked open in a wash of blood-red light. The first sliver of sun bleeding over the jagged canyon edge like the earth had been torn in two. Down in the hollow, Murdoch's camp lay quiet, men sleeping light with rifles at their sides. Boots still on, dreams tangled in fear. Smoke from the dying fire curled like ghosts above their blankets. Somewhere, a coyote cried once and went silent. Then came the first shot, a sharp, thunderclap crack that split the stillness clean through. One of the guards standing watch jerked back with a hole where his eye had been. He didn't even have time to scream before he collapsed in a heap. Another shot, even before the body hit the ground. The second man dropped beside the horses, his rifle sliding from his hands as blood bloomed across his chest. Panic erupted like fire in dry grass. Up! Get up! We're under fire! Shouts flew in every direction. Boots scraped dirt. Men ran, half-blind, grabbing pistols, diving for cover. Bullets started to fly wildly, at shadows, rocks, the wind. They didn't know where death was coming from, only that it was moving like smoke and striking without sound. Annabeth jerked awake at the noise, heart hammering. She looked through the slats of her makeshift cage and saw chaos. Someone had dropped a rifle just a few feet from her, the barrel still warm. One of the men must have died before finishing his watch. Her wrists were raw from rope, her arms weak, but she didn't stop. She used a rock to wear down the knot, sawing furiously as gunfire lit the camp. Men screamed. Some didn't finish the sound. A third shot rang out, this one echoed. A man on the ridge tried to return fire, and was silenced by a single, precise crack. His body tumbled down the rocks, limp as a rag. Annabeth broke free. Her hand shook as she grabbed the fallen pistol and rolled out from under the grate. She crawled behind a crate of salted beef, breathing hard, the weapon slick with blood. Not hers, not yet. She spotted Murdoch at the center of it all, barking orders, red-faced and furious. "Find him! Find the bastard!" he roared. "He ain't no ghost, damn it. He's just a man." But his voice held a note of fear. A crack in the ice. From high above, the shooter moved like vapor, one with the shadows. Another outlaw went down, a clean shot to the throat. They'd started with 12. Now 5 remained. Then silence. Not the silence of calm, but of breath held, of a storm pausing mid-roar. And out of the smoke came a shape, long coat coated in red dust, hat low, boots silent, rifle slung low, still smoking. He walked straight down the ridge path like he owned it, shoulders square, gait slow and deliberate. The men still alive raised their guns, hesitated. It was something in the way he moved, like he'd already buried them. Clay Murdoch stepped forward, teeth bared. "That you, Cade?" he shouted. The figure stopped. Even from across the camp, Annabeth could see the rifle, long, blackened steel, with hand-carved notches. The man held it with the ease of someone who didn't miss. Thomas Cade said nothing. He just stopped walking and stood still. Clay spit on the ground. "I figured you'd come crawling. For her. Should have left her to die. She's not worth it." Annabeth gripped the pistol tighter, teeth clenched. Thomas took 3 more steps, stopped again. 50 paces, Murdoch said, voice lowering. "No tricks. Just you and me. You got the gall for that." Cade didn't answer. They backed away from each other, counting aloud. At 20, Murdoch's voice cracked slightly. At 35, Thomas rolled his shoulder like an old wound ached. At 50, they turned. 2 guns. 2 men. 1 moment. The sun rose fully then, spilling fire across the cliffs. A single shot. Murdoch's shoulder burst red, spinning him sideways. His return fire was rushed, clipped Cade in the thigh. The older man staggered, went to one knee, but didn't drop the rifle. Murdoch tried to lift his pistol again. Thomas fired a second time. This one didn't miss. The bullet caught Murdoch clean in the heart. He stood for half a second, as if surprised, then crumpled like dry paper. Silence settled. Only the wind moved now. Annabeth ran, over the bodies, past the fire pit, boots slipping in blood and sand. She found him kneeling, clutching his thigh, breath short. Dust and sweat clung to every inch of him, his face pale beneath the dirt. The rifle still hung in his hand. She knelt in front of him, eyes wide with shock, and something else, recognition. "You must be Thomas," she said softly. He nodded once, slow, like a man surrendering not to her, but to something deeper. Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed into her arms. Rain tapped the tin roof in a slow, steady rhythm, soft as a lullaby. Inside the dim cabin, the air smelled of warm broth, wood smoke, and chamomile. Thomas Cade stirred beneath wool blankets, his breath shallow but steady. The bullet wound in his thigh had scabbed over, and the bruises that once painted his ribs had faded to ghostly yellows. He blinked at the low light, flickering from a fireplace, momentarily unsure where the war had left him this time. A soft rustle drew his eyes to the corner of the room. Annabeth sat in the rocking chair, darning a pair of socks. Her hands moved automatically, but her eyes were on him the moment he stirred. She stood, slow and careful, setting the socks aside. "You're awake," she said, her voice like spring water, clear, calm, unexpected. He nodded once, tried to sit, grimaced. "Easy." She was at his side in seconds, adjusting the pillow behind his back. "How long?" His voice was cracked, brittle from disuse. 2 weeks since you opened your eyes. But you've been here almost a month. She smiled faintly, brushing a lock of damp hair from his forehead. Stubborn as a mule. I told you not to die, and you must have listened. He looked past her to the corner of the room where his rifle rested, propped neatly beneath a dusty window. The Spencer hadn't been touched since the day he collapsed in that canyon, bleeding and spent. He closed his eyes, jaw tight. You should have gone back east, he murmured. You didn't owe me anything. Annabeth's face shifted, not into anger, but something firmer, something grounded. I know I didn't, she said. But you came. You crossed half the desert alone, because you read one letter and decided I was worth saving. She stepped back, folding her arms. You were the only one who came. That makes you my husband, whether we say vows or not. Thomas opened his mouth, but no argument came. The shame he'd carried, of who he was, what he'd done, had no words strong enough to stand against hers. He looked down, the old calluses on his hands catching the firelight. I wasn't much of a man, he said. Not then. Not after the war. You were the only kind of man who could have done what needed doing, she replied, stepping closer. And you didn't do it for glory. You did it because someone needed help. He looked up at her, something soft breaking loose behind his eyes. Then, slow as the dawn, he smiled. The next morning, you walked for the first time, leaning hard on a cane, with Annabeth guiding him like she'd done it her whole life. The land outside stretched wide and golden beneath a pale sky, cotton clouds drifting like faded memories. The cattle were gone, the fences half fallen, but the soil still clung to the promise of life. Spring crept in one green blade at a time. Annabeth planted sweet corn near the well. Thomas mended the gate with hands steadier than he expected. They said little, but each word was weighted with quiet gratitude. The dog, returned from wherever it had wandered, limped along beside them. At night, they shared the porch swing and listened to the coyotes yip in the distance. The wind spoke through the pines. Sometimes she'd read to him old books, half-missing pages. Sometimes he'd hum low tunes with no name, just rhythm and memory. The Spencer rifle now hung on 2 iron hooks above the fireplace. Cleaned, oiled, unloaded. It stayed there untouched, unless it must be touched again. And in the hush of those desert nights, when the stars stretched endless and silent above, folks in the nearby towns would sometimes speak of the man who walked into the canyons alone, a man no one had seen for years, who stepped out of the rock and smoked like a myth with a rifle in his hands and the fire of justice in his eyes. They called him a ghost. They called him a legend. But the truth, told quietly on porches and around small fires, was simpler. And that's how the quietest man in the Arizona sands became a legend, not for the men he killed, but the woman he saved.